So, Favour, we're back for the second episode in our Aid Effectiveness and Value for Money mini-series. And today we have a really wonderful guest. We have Peter J. Evans, or as he goes by in his Twitter handle or X handle, Not That Peter Evans.
Yes, and I'm going to leave the joke for later in the episode for our audience to find out. But yes, it was quite funny when he gives the backstory of why he's not that Peter Evans. But yes, this episode, and I know it's really close to home for you, Richard. I know you have a petition out for against the aid courts happening in the UK. So beyond it being insightful and thought provoking, I know this was something that is you hold dear to heart. So what are your thoughts basically, even as we just start off the episode for today?
Well, look, cards on the table. I'm a big advocate for aid and international development assistance. And part of the reason why I'm a big advocate is because I've seen the positive impact of it on the ground in countries like Nigeria and in Pakistan. So I am starting from the starting point of being a supporter of aid and international development expenditure. And I think the fact that we've got this aid effectiveness and value for money mini series is premised on the existence of aid expenditure, international development expenditure. And I think for decades, that was taken for granted, right? That you would always have an obligation in a way from rich countries, from developed countries, to be providing some sort of support or some sort of assistance to support countries that were further behind in their economic development and various other forms of development. And it's an odd period that we're going through at the moment, because I don't think we can now take that for granted. The groundswell that was there in the past, the Jubilee debt campaign, the various campaigns where you see sort of Bono and others, Bob Geldof and all the rest sort of rallying, you know, that kind of base isn't there anymore, or it doesn't feel like it's there anymore, not in the same numbers. And so when we have conversations about international development, the framing has gone from one extreme to the other. So at one extreme, aid or international development expenditure can be seen as like charity, as something that you give to those who, in the way that you would give to perhaps somebody on the street who was less fortunate than yourself. And it's framed in that way. At the other extreme, it's framed as being something very self-interested, and it's about promoting your agenda in another country. And I think the reality is that aid often sits somewhere in between, in the space between there. And actually, there are other lenses that you can take to it as well, in terms of empowerment, in terms of how you can help break traps, poverty traps, how you can help break vicious cycles that have been set up by history and legacy, systemic issues as well. And I think what's really nice about this episode in the miniseries is it helps us look at some of the complexities. So where I'm going from on this, and I think Peter is as well, is not that aid is a bad thing or aid and international development assistance should not exist. It's about thinking how we can make sure that what we do spend is being impactful and making a difference in the lives of people on the ground. And I think that's the spirit in which this episode is coming from.
Yes, exactly. And I think one thing that human beings are known for is our ability to adapt. It's our ability to adapt that has kept us alive all these many years. And so now that we are in this season of eight courts, we can't stay on the ground. It's now, okay, how do we take what we are being given and pivot? And so that's really the meat of this episode, saying that we are in an era of eight courts. We hope that the system gets better. But as it is right now, we are working with little like much budget that are quite small compared to what we have had in the past, but we're not just going to just fizzle out. No, this is now a time for us to adapt and see how we can grow. And so it's a really exciting episode, and I know our viewers are going to enjoy hearing from Peter.
Yeah, so let's have a listen to what Peter has to say.
Hello, Peter. Thank you so much once again for coming on the show. We are really excited to have you here. So, if you don't mind, could you introduce yourself to the Flywheel Economics audience?
So good morning. I'm Peter Evans. I'm not an economist. I began my work in public health, social sciences. So I have a health origin, and then I worked in various roles before joining DFID as a social development advisor. So I transitioned from social development to governance, and I've always had a bit of a thread of governance, public sector reform, and politics, so applied political economy in my work. I left government after 20 years and became the director of the U4 Anti-Corruption Resource Centre in Bergen. I did that for 2 years. And then for the last nearly 2 years, I've been a jobbing consultant, busybody, and also trying to instigate a new piece of work in Oxford to put applied practical political economy analysis out in the mainstream, so open access, plain language, and try and make it useful for all. Yeah, I'm not the most famous Peter Evans in the field. There's a very famous American political sociologist called Peter Evans, who is older and much more esteemed than me. So I often refer to myself as not that Peter Evans. So that's my handle on most social media. Not that Peter Evans.
Well, thank you, Peter. You're the Peter Evans that we wanted at the very least for this podcast. So thank you for joining us. I'll go straight into we've got lots of deep questions for you today, so we're really going to put your brain to the test, but I know you'll be more than up for it. Reflecting on the shrinking aid industry and thinking about the future, aid has never really been the dominant financial force in development, but it's often been catalytic. As its relative size declines, how do you think we should recalibrate our expectations without losing sight of what it can still achieve?
So I think this question more or less summarizes my 20 years in government, in that I joined DFID when DFID was still fairly new, in the Clare short years, when it seemed that aid could change the world. And for me, at least, it rapidly became clear that aid was big for us, less large in the eyes of recipients, and its ability to change the world was less than we might have thought in the heyday. But also, there were other flows that were bigger and more important. I'm a political economy wonk. I believe that context is really important, and that with all of our other tools in the aid toolbox, it's really important to invest a bit in understanding political economy, context of the countries that we work with, and also of our own country and our own aid giving. So I would say recalibration is partly, or my response is partly, that we should keep on using the things that I think are important. So not assume that there's a sort of one size fits all, that we can throw large money at problems, etc. But keep on focusing on context. But it remains to be seen exactly how the shrinking of UK aid will play out. I mean, I see lots of commentary and lots of rumours about for example, the shrinking and death of most bilateral aid, proposals that we go multilateral with the bulk of it. But I would say that it's ever more important to understand the real politics, the real incentives at play in growth and development in the regions and the countries that we seek to see progressive, positive change. So that's my starting answer. As someone who, in 20 years in government, imagined that growth was being done by other people, and I would focus on governance and service delivery and health and education, I'm a sort of late believer, or I realized very late that actually aid's failure, or public policy's failure to unlock more effective growth is a crying shame. But also I focus much more of my attention now on well, what can unlock growth? So I've shifted my perspective on how aid and how diminishing aid should be spent. I think we should think much more about structural change and reform, and the constraints that stop countries growing, that stop job creation, etc., rather than believing that somehow aid can pay down the delivery of better health, better education, services, etc. So I've really changed my perspective on that. And some of my work now is focused on things like public procurement reform, which may sound like a sort of a big government public sector reform, traditional enterprise, but actually it's much more about how governments spend money in, for example, building infrastructure. in order to try and unlock growth, rather than public procurement reform merely as a sort of public financial management, a tool to try and safeguard resources. So I'm much more growth focused than I was in the days of big aid, and also in my time in government. So that's my starting point.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was such a thoughtful answer. And so, just flowing from that, if we acknowledge that aid serves both geopolitical and development ends, how do we navigate the tension and ensure that the zeal for changing lives and effectiveness for communities on the ground isn't lost in the mix?
So I think that for some time we believed that aid was somehow not a self-serving part of foreign policy tools, and some of the aid effectiveness commentary narrative kind of assumes that somehow aid is a pure resource only to be spent on benevolent ends in other countries. And I think that my time in government taught me that this was, our selection of where to work and what to work on always had a hint, a hue of UK's strategic interests, UK's economic interest to a degree. And the merger of DFID and the Foreign Office really underlined this. So some of the so I really believe in aid effectiveness and changing lives. And the reason that I got into this work was because I wanted to, see change in the world. However, the more I got into the politics and the political economy of UK engagement and aid within that, I think the two parts, so aid and development and foreign policy, seem to merge. And I've worked in countries like Malawi, Bangladesh, and India most significantly, and I can see these interests sort of merging. And I think that the reality is where we spend aid will be partly dictated by where we think we have a foreign policy or a geopolitical interest, and it could be based on history, on post-colonial legacy, or it could be where we seek to have influence now. But it definitely won't be a kind of a purely altruistic delivery of aid funds where need is greatest. And I think that's fairly natural, and I think all aid-giving countries do a bit of this. I take some succor from the fact that a lot of pure aid spent on only on with the intent of doing good has been badly spent. So doing it with a bit more foreign policy, you might say cynicism or nous, won't necessarily be worse than in the heyday of purist large aid. And I was involved in general budget support, direct budget support, sector budget support. So I did help spend huge amounts of money that may not have had the intended impact in some countries that had their own agendas and struggle to spend that aid effectively, or the incentives which is not lined up to do that. But I think that our presence in those countries also had a foreign policy hook, which was as important as the aid spend. It's slightly unusual for me today in that talking about aid is something I do less of than I used to. And I'm a public policy flag waver in that one thing over the last, I guess, decade is when I think of public policy problems that need to be solved in the world or in the UK by anyone and using any flows. I may say public policy or development, and some people, and particularly traditional colleagues and allies, will hear aid. So I take pains to say, I'm interested in problem solving, regardless of the source of funds. And so my starting point is the problem and the public policy options to address that problem, and then stepping back, thinking about who might pay for it, which puts the point about aid being small and declining in size. It kind of puts that into perspective. So I think stepping back to public policy helps to have a healthier, more open conversation rather than the slightly nerdy focus of aid and only aid. So I'm the annoying person who corrects people when I say development, they say aid, and I say, no, I'm not saying aid, I'm saying public policy, problems anywhere to be addressed by any source of resource or energy.
Thanks, Peter. So I guess whether an international donor or whether a foundation of some sorts, or, if an organization goes through a cut in available funding, there's always this internal competition, or there always seems to be this internal competition. Okay, we have fewer resources than we had before. Which is the most worthy sector to spend in? Are we spending in, say, health, education, water and sanitation, the very visible, the typically visible signs of, international development assistance, or are we doing things in governance and economic development, and sometimes the more systems and the less tangible, often, side of development? So, typically, from your experience in the past, how do these things play out, and what have we learnt from past cycles of cuts from donors?
So I think that the short answer is they usually play out in quite an ugly way, and so the mutual recognition of diverse inputs into a system project, which may be there in times of plenty, tend to rapidly diminish in times of shortage. And I'm a sort of, I'm a governance, inclusion, and political economy person. So my work has always been smaller budget than the big sectors. But in times of plenty, I think the big sectors, health, agriculture, energy, education, etc., have seen the merit of having someone, governance-y, public sector reformy, political economy type on board. I have experienced the pain of when my meager budget that sort of exists in the space between the very large traditional sector programs is regarded as far down the Excel sheet, and therefore can be trimmed off when times get tough. So that is painful. And I imagine that will repeat. And sometimes this is those who project themselves as being closest to saving lives now tend to say that their budget is most in need of protection. And those of us who work on long-term change and sort of system tweaks may be regarded as able to take a very severe haircut, which I think is a shame. Yeah, I don't want to put my finger on previous cuts and how it played out, but it can be painful, and solidarity can rapidly diminish when the tribes within an aid agency start scrapping for resources. I would go back to early work on civil society, on human rights in some very large country programs, which had very, very large investments in lots and lots of rights-based civil society programs, which were energetic, enthusiastic, I think life-changing for those on the margins of those countries. And yet they fell victim to a change in perspective maybe 10, 15 years ago. And those budgets were shrunk while investment in the private sector development, particularly returnable capital, grew. So you often see these trade-offs, compromises. And I think for me, the rapid decline of civil society funding and human rights funding, and the rapid growth of returnable capital investment for the private sector, it really was an early version of the we need to spend more money on defence. Let's pillage aid. So these completely crazy trade-offs of two unrelated things, a bucket of money that is needed, and you tend to the system tends to focus on that which has least support, or that is least able to defend itself. So, Richard, I know you've been trying to mobilise support to protect the aid budget, but I think it is incredibly difficult. And as many commentators have said, if you don't have powerful people or the public making a noise in support of an area of public spending like aid, it's very hard to see off the night of the long knives, or the weekend of the long knives in the recent aid cut case. So it's tough. But I fear the worst. So there are sort of sector fights over what survives, And then there are sort of ideas. I think we've seen this on social media and in various blogs and debates. So the bilateral versus multilateral, the recent debate on or propositions on radical simplification versus engaging with political economy, etc. So there are contests between, you might say, sectors, so health versus other things, and contests between ideas, multilateral, bilateral, etc. Which I think the answer will be somewhere in the middle. A messy mix of them all, which goes back to the point about aid and foreign policy being intermingled, in that some of the purist arguments, so for example, we should put all the money through multilateral spending because it's more effective, I think is pretty alien to the idea of aid being something that the public, any public, would want to invest in or understand. And I think that the geopolitical benefits of having an aid program are also much easier to realize, I guess, in theory, with a bilateral program than putting all money into multilateral pots. Irrespective of the argument about leverage of pooling funds and the $1 in for $4 out in multilateral pots versus more or less 1-for-1 in bilateral pots. So I'm aiming for a messy compromise that doesn't dump all the things that I hold dear out. So context, politics, understanding public sectors, motivations, incentives of elites, all that kind of stuff. And it's pretty low budget.
Thank you very much, Peter. You mentioned just a while ago about radical simplification and also your joke about correcting people when they say aid and telling them it's development. And so we know that as you said rightly, that there has been growing pressure to simplify aid. But where is simplification helpful and where might it risk overlooking context, complexity, or long-term change?
So I've always liked to hedge my bets. So for 6 or 7 years, I was the head of the governance, inclusion, humanitarian, and conflict research team in old DFID headquarters, and I tried to manage a mixed portfolio of research in those themes, which covered everything from political economy through to randomized controlled trials, and ensure that we had a balanced portfolio and that everyone knew we had one. So basically, I wasn't favoring any particular method. I was trying to focus in on problems that were important for public policy and even aid, and invest in a mix of research. Now, obviously the investing then in randomized controlled trials, RCTs, was part of a kind of a revolution within public policy and aid, in that these were things that were on the rise. They were popular. If you weren't on the RCT bandwagon, then you were in danger of being left behind. However, while we did great work in governance and conflict using experiments, the risk was that people would see our complex themes as simple, and somehow there would be a set of verified, proven, effective solutions to what were very complex system problems. So with this backdrop, I think this is where the radical simplification agenda comes from. Favouring a certain kind of evidence, which I value, but I also value messy, descriptive political economy stuff too, and leading to the idea that you can be very effective and very efficient by putting most of your money on a few things, which I think works to an extent, but it doesn't address the long-term messy stuff that I work in. So I think that radical simplification, so the paper put out by Rachel Glenister recently, is interesting, but I think that it could be part of the future, whereas purists in thinking about RCTs and about what works and about best buys, etc., I think are at risk of either wanting to or by accident driving through that as the only way, which I think is very, very dangerous. And some of the thinking in radical simplification. So, for example, find something that really works, and then look for countries that are willing to to accept the money. I think is just not how the real world works. So, to choose countries based on whether they're willing to have a certain kind of investment is just at odds with all of the intertwining of aid and foreign policy that I see in my reality, and therefore I think is a bit extreme. The final point I'd say on radical simplification. So this is a version of the what works or the best buys thinking, which I think has been interesting, but sometimes has had unintended consequences, seeing the world a bit too simply. When I was a research team leader in old DFID, I tried to resist doing a what works or a best buys in governance, because I said that governance is such a massively complex and varied field that this will be a huge bit of work. It will be unsatisfactory in outcome if we ever get there, and then no one will use it. And we've compiled bodies of evidence before on the many component parts of sort of governance and politics. And we tend to finish the job, and then no one uses the database, and then we start a new one. And I think that that's exactly what happened with governance. So my lobbying to not do it failed, and so we did do it, and I was partially involved. But I'm not sure that it was a great and useful piece of work because it was so complex. And I'm not sure that it's ever been published, although I think it has been cited as grey literature. So I think that we should be cautious about radical simplification. I was just reading Ken Opalo's blog, touching on three big ideas in the future of aid, and I think Ken says what he does like, but says that he likes a bit of all, or notes that they have some commonalities, and I think that's where my mind is and my gut is, that all of these things will contribute to the future of aid rather than winning the battle. And similarly, the piece by Will Paxton and Guy Lodge in response to and replying to Kevin Watkins, I think that there's some great thinking there, but I think the future should be bits of all of those things rather than anyone winning outright. An outright knockout punch is unlikely, but also unwanted, I think.
Thanks, Peter. I'm reminded of my very early days in DFID when I went to an economist conference, and the chief economist at the time, who wasn't Stefan Durkin, by the way, he stood up and rather piously said to us all as young economists that we should all remember that South Korea did not transform its economy on the back of a BedNet project. And I think it was said with quite a lot of impact, but I think it was about that whole tension around how far can we go with the radical simplification? Okay, maybe you have really strong evidence that something is going to be impactful in what it's intending to do, but where are the limits as well, and where does the complexity and the messiness come in as some of the other areas that you speak to? So anyway, it just popped to mind as you were looking at those tensions there.
I think,
go ahead.
Can I just run that?
Yeah.
So I think that's a great example. And my PhD was on community-based malaria control, so particularly bed nets, which transformed many people's lives. And I worked in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam. However, they were an important public health intervention that had a huge importance and impact, but did little for growth and jobs. And so I do feel, and yeah, I do agree with your point. And also looking historically about how growth has happened. I've worked with on and off Mushtaq Khan for I guess decades now. And in the early days, Mushtaq was great at saying, listening to DFID people and particularly governance people and saying these ideas are really really interesting, but they're completely not how any country has ever managed to grow or get out of poverty. So I think we have to look at also history about how change really happens, and then put our interventions, public policy interventions, aid interventions within that perspective to think about exactly how much change we can facilitate, catalyze, or whatever.
Okay, thanks, Peter. All right, so this question now is going to try and circle back a bit to some of these things. So, what can we really learn from the fat aid era? If we want to be uncharitable and call it the fat aid era, what can we learn from it? Large scale funding in the past supported significant innovations and institutional reforms, but what mixed legacy has it left, and how should we adapt our methods in these leaner times?
I think that's a fat question for Fat Eight. I think simple lessons. One is the failure to really do much about growth, unlocking growth, structural reform, unless a country was already committed to and already on that path. So I think that's one lesson. Two is when we focus on countries that aid community, the UK and aid has had a long-term relationship with, and whether our large aid has helped our country partners get out of a particular problem loop. I think the answer is often no. So big aid didn't work. I began my DFID career in Malawi, and I haven't done much work in Malawi over the last 20 years, but I often have done or supported research or policy work that has worked with or in Malawi. And I see, some of the same problems again and again and again. And I think, well, aid failed. What was, despite all the money that we committed, what do we hope would happen that didn't happen? And things like public procurement reform, pharmaceutical purchase by government and distribution to people is still incredibly leaky and inefficient. And so I think that big aid hasn't worked there, and why. So I think, as many have touched on, where it has worked is in innovation, health, and pharmaceutical development, humanitarian response. So there you could argue that it was worth having big aid. However, the work I do in health is particularly on health systems and health service delivery, and I think we haven't had much effect on those systems, even if we did spend lots of money. So I think the lessons are patchy. I guess with a sort of 20 to 30 year sweep, the most important lesson is modesty. So we touched on the reality that aid was never one of the largest flows and has diminished greatly. So we should never get ahead of ourselves. And I, also look back in the way we structured, we meaning the international aid establishment, things like the MDGs and the SDGs. And I think Ken Apollo's been very good on this in the last year on, any country that basically buys into somebody else's list of policy priorities is probably not doing the right thing, committed to or incentivized to its own grip on reform and change. And I think that's a sad reality. It's a reflection of the failure of big aid, in that we imagine that by having a super list and then countries buying into that and us pretending it was their list, that somehow that would be a solution to the great challenges we see. So I think that's another lesson. Before I joined DFID, I'd never heard of, or I barely heard of the MDGs. And so when I was interviewed to join, I was a bit surprised that most of the questions were about the MDGs. This is in 2000, I think. And then I had muted enthusiasm through the next sort of 15 years. And then when the SDGs came along, I struggled to really feel very enthusiastic. And governance and corruption was enshrined in one of the SDGs. And so I'd have to talk about it quite a lot. I can't remember which one it is now. Is it 15? I'm not sure. Anyway, it was almost like a pantomime of touching these magic beads that would somehow help transform the world. But I was never a massive enthusiast, and I'm definitely not now, sadly.
It's interesting on that theme of sort of radical simplification. If you think how simple the list of MDGs were potentially, right? It was a very small, slim list of areas to work on. And if anything, the SDGs was about complicating that somewhat, and what you, in a sense, you lost some degree of power in terms of the communication of it by the increased complexity that came with it. But there's a lot, certainly speaks to the trade-offs, I think, in the radical simplification versus the more messy and chaotic world that we're in. And even the SDGs are, radical simplifications, I guess, as well, even if there's more of them or more sub-indicators.
I try not to be too cynical, but yeah, it's almost like a whole industry, and the colors and the symbols and the subcomponents, etc. It's almost like a mantra that you had to learn, or a set of spells that you had to know by heart. So I would say that I did wear the very attractive SCG badge on my suit lapel when in the days where I had to wear a suit, and so I did buy in to a degree, but it never seemed like the overall solution.
Thanks, Peter. So let's talk about context and getting serious about context. Are we finally seeing a shift towards embedding political economy and the broader contextual diagnostics at the heart of program and design delivery? Or is it still more rhetoric than reality?
I think it's somewhere between rhetoric and reality. I think that many very large investments in policy, public policy aid, whatever, are still very technocratic and relatively blind to or thin on an understanding of particular context. And politics, political economy, context, people who have, who work in mainstream sectors, growth, health, education, they often fear the P word. So this idea that somehow they don't want, or they fear having a conversation about the politics of their focal country or their sector, or their own country or own sector. So I think that's a challenge. I think so part of my work these days is trying to de-risk, reduce the fear of talking about small p politics, so the politics of health service delivery in wherever. So how does procurement really work? Who are the interests who may be incentivized or may active in reducing effectiveness? Cartels, organized leakage, etc., etc., etc. So trying to talk about that in a way that doesn't scare people off, which is a challenge. But I think we're making some progress. It's also I try and use examples from private sector investment, saying if big companies invest in understanding political risk, shouldn't big development or big aid, and you can learn how to do it, or you can pay other people to do it, which is part of where my consulting work comes from. And it's relatively low cost. When people say to me, how much would it cost to do a political economy analysis, a useful one, of sector X in country Y, I say 20, 30, 40, 50,000 quid, pounds, for your international audience. And that may underpin or be part of the design or part of the risk management of a budget that could be 10, 50, 100 million, 250 million pounds or dollars. So sometimes the investment cost of doing political economy analysis is pretty small compared with the cost of the entire investment program, but also the cost of managing or administrating such a program. So I think that it is a relatively low budget activity. However, people need to want it and accept it and have the confidence to talk about it, which is a big part of the work that we're doing under the nascent Practical Politics platform, so a new initiative in Oxford, to try and do this stuff in public. So responsibly talking about difficult politics, putting out public products that are plain language, open access, not using too much mystical political science language, to try and get these things onto the mainstream policy table. It's not easy, but we are making progress, because too much political economy analysis is if it is done, it's private, so it's a private good for whoever can pay for it. But it may be too sensitive to ever see the light of day. So my maybe the last 10 years of my career, I want to really put some effort into getting this stuff out in public, and reducing the fear. Final point on context is, I think some bilateral donors have rediscovered their love of or their interest in diagnostics, so basically country diagnostics. But rather than being, from 10, 15 years ago, a sort of a compendium of economic statistics, actually more interest in political economy, distribution of power, how elites are formed and how they operate, what the sort of equilibrium of dominant elite is in a country, how it's affected by electoral cycles, etc. So I think we are making progress. Context, diagnostics, political economy, all these things are sort of moving in a similar field, and I think it's useful. I hope it's useful.
Thanks, Peter. But just to push you a bit further on this, in terms of the practicality of some of the tools we have in political economy, and some of the emerging ones, which I suspect you'll be involved with. But it's one thing to say, okay, in your sector you can do a political economy analysis, and it's pretty cheap to do. But often in the sectors we're working on, there could be hundreds of interventions that are going on, and each with slightly different flavors of political economies that are feeding in, different interest groups, different. How do we have these kind of tools for political economy that can be applicable not just for the broad sector, but when you're designing one of 100 interventions, and when you've got different vested interests in those sectors, and really being able to navigate them are going to be the make or break of your intervention?
So, great question, and I think also reflects the grim, the sad reality of fragmentation of efforts in any major sector in many countries. So I think one approach is to start at a high enough level such that some of the lessons or insights will be generalizable. So I do quite a lot of work on the political economy analysis of the public sector, and within that, public procurement, for example. So most governments spend the majority of their money on payroll, on procuring stuff, and I guess increasingly on debt. And so any government delivery channel will include big slabs of budget through these channels. So one thing is trying to make a sector analysis focus on the questions that are big enough to affect all of those smaller interventions, and then I guess drilling down a bit. So within health, public procurement, within public procurement, pharmaceuticals, procurement, distribution, logistics, etc., etc. So that will be relevant for a range of interests and interventions in a health sector in a country like Malawi, for example. So I think that you can try and choose themes and sub-themes that will have most relevance to the biggest number of interventions. And then if you want to go micro, in terms of using it as a tool to understand particular barriers to, investment in renewable energy in country Y, I think you can go sort of super micro. But the tools are relatively scalable. So you touched on tools. So I tend to use a boiled down version of you might say the classic DFID and later USAID framework for political economy analysis, stripping out some of the complexity and the the difficult political science words, and applying that, either myself with other consultants, or ideally with people from country governments to try and work through their own problems. So this is the classic, what's the problem and why do we care? Who are the players relevant to this problem? What are the rules of the game, both formal and informal? A sense of the so what, so the state of the equilibrium or the elite bargain. And then trying to work through, what can we do about that? So getting to the sort of political feasible reform, Are there any win-wins? How can you, gently nudge elites to move into a more progressive direction, etc.? So it's all relatively straightforward, and trying to make it accessible and plain language such that we don't alienate people. The sticking point is sometimes, and it's probably the only word that I insist on using, is elite, which maybe morally I can't let it go, but I'll surrender virtually every other term or explain it in using different words. But when it comes to elite, I do try and say, well, to not use the word elite is a risk of denying that there really is one. And if you deny that there really is one, we may be part of it, part of the elite. So let's unpack ourselves. Which also relates to a focus also on the political, or the role of external actors as political actors in the game in the country. So not letting donors and multilaterals off the hook. They may commission the political economy, but they also have to be part of the focus. So not imagining that they're neutral, progressive, godlike observers who only want to see good, but actually recognizing that they're players in the game. Sorry, that was a rather long answer, but I do talk about political economy a lot. So you just had probably a dose of my my indomitable refusal to give up on making the case for it.
Well, let's take it to one of the sectors you work very closely on, and you headed up U4, the anti-corruption research and leading thought leader in the anti-corruption space. Well, I mean, when anti-corruption campaigns get some degree of momentum, but then down the line they lose a bit of steam, what what can donors do, or what can international development partners or foundations or whatever, what can they do to help keep things going, to protect local interests? How, what lessons did you take away from that with your political economy hat on?
So that's a great question. I should say that I'm a super generalist, as in I do and have done lots of things. I happened to design DFID's anti-corruption evidence, so the ACE program, when I was leading a research team, and somehow that got me into the world of anti-corruption. So becoming the director of an anti-corruption organization was based on one of several bits of work I did in my last sort of 6 years in DFID. So there's an irony there. I guess what I reflect on from my days in U4 were, firstly, self-reflection. I'm a public policy problem solver. I'm not a lifelong committed anti-corruption person. And corruption is one part of many public policy problems, but it's rarely the only problem to address, to resolve the problem and realize real world change and outcome. So, for example, corruption in health is an important constraint, but is one of many constraints, and only working on corruption is probably a bit limiting if you really want to make real world change. So U4 is a great platform and resource for the stock of advice on anti-corruption, which it refreshes, but it has great depth of advice too. And I was humbled in my time there by meeting people from the Philippines or from Mongolia who said, when we need to understand anti-corruption or a new corruption problem, the first place we look is the U4 database. So I think that is a massive plaudit. However, for me, the focus on anti-corruption only was a bit too much. And there is quite a lot of technocratic or values-based work in anti-corruption, which doesn't really suit me. So I don't think that's how the real world works. And if you're a student of incentives and motivations, etc., moral or values-based approach to public policy can be quite frustrating, regardless of the field. During my time at U4, it was really the time of the Biden administration's massive increase in focus on global corruption. Much of which was very good. It was hugely well resourced by the American government. And it had some aspects that I think were unhelpful. So the idea of strategic corruption, but with a focus on Russia and China as the bad is. Resourcing anti-corruption efforts in an extremely generous way. So suddenly it was a field in which there was lots of money sloshing about. And then the classic US aid or American government model, whereby you often fund through American intermediaries, which made them very powerful in the world of anti-corruption. So I had misgivings about this, and I hope it wasn't just because you four had a few conversations about getting US aid funds or US State Department funds too, and in the end we didn't solve, we didn't land a deal. So I hope I'm not just speaking out of sour grapes, but I always had some misgivings about this US domination, and I think I still have misgivings now. Of course, the collapse of US support for anti-corruption in the world has been terrible and put a lot of principled and brave actors in many countries at risk, because suddenly the global support from the US government has gone in a flash and they are now exposed. However, going back to your point about the lessons from fat aid or big aid, I think we have to be careful about what happens if ever we lose the appetite or lose the resources or lose the funding to continue the world, continue funding the world that we like to create, because it does leave people exposed. And I felt this myself in DFID days, going back to the civil society human rights funding, that we were big, we encouraged brave people to stand up and speak out, and then suddenly we were gone. And a lot of their sense of security was based on having cross-border international friends, and suddenly we weren't there and said we weren't really interested anymore. So I do fear the unintended consequences. Finally, where should anti-corruption go next? Well, it should solve problems. So I've never been someone who's interested in less corruption as a thing. I see it as a means to bringing better stuff in the world. So better outcomes in health, education, growth, private sector investment, whatever. So I think a problem-solving approach in which sees corruption in its many variants as part of, but not the only problem, is how I would go ahead. Sorry, final. Of course, I'd much rather have Biden big funding for anti-corruption than what's happened since then. So, real sense now that we're in the very opposite. We're in an administration that allows, permits, even encourages the kind of behaviour that we used to be explicitly against, which I think is extremely worrying for the world. So I'd much rather moan about there being too much money than have what we have now. So please don't get me wrong.
Thank you, Peter. Final question now for you. Thinking about a sort of more modest but perhaps more grounded future, given everything we've learned, what does a credible, grounded, politically aware model of aid effectiveness look like for the decade ahead? And where is the greatest space for meaningful impact?
That's just a small question to end with. So I think modesty and not having grandiose claims whenever we seek to invest in something new or additional. So I think we had a sort of an arms race of hype in many aid investments, and now we need to be much more grounded and realistic about the change we can actually help to catalyze. And in some areas that I work on, so public procurement in many countries, some people think, oh, that sounds really dry and dull. Shouldn't, if it's aid-funded political economy or public sector reform advice, shouldn't we be thinking bigger? And I say, but 40% of this government's budget is spent through public procurement, and it's still really leaky and lousy. So surely this is a significant problem to focus, diminishing aid on with our partners in country. So the colossal scale of even the small things, I think, is worth thinking about. We don't need to be grandiose in terms of X million, squillion children in school, etc., etc. We could do good by thinking about significant constraints in single countries. So I guess then reducing the Christmas tree tendencies, but without going the full radical simplification hog, is how I'd see the future. And also with small aid, I hope that, and particularly UK aid, we pioneered a range of approaches, including doing some of the heavy lifting on thinking about context and political economy and diagnostic. We may not have the money now we the UK may not have the money now to spend big as a result of these analyses. However, by making them, by doing them, because I think we're quite good at it, and making them available to other players, including country governments, civil society, the IMF and the World Bank, I think that could be a new niche for us. So there's nothing more frustrating than doing such analysis and no one using it, or the person who funds it unable to use it because they haven't got the money to design a program. But making that generally available to others in some form, I think is a good way of seeing the future for small aid. So, and that's probably a plug for my own work. So I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for taking time to share your thoughts on the future of aid with us today.
It's been a pleasure.
Well, some really interesting thoughts shared by Peter. Favour, what's your reaction? What's your initial reaction, having had a few days to reflect on the interview with Peter?
Yes, I thought this was an extremely, really, really insightful and a good episode. I think that's the word. It was such a good episode. And I always enjoy the fact that the guests that we get on the Flyway Economics podcast are people that are well versed. And so that experience really shines through in our conversations with them. And I think without meaning to, with our aid effectiveness and value for money series, we are kind of wading into controversial waters because we've known that the development sector has taken a hit. And I know, Richard, you have been in the sector longer than I have, and I'm not sure if I've seen anything quite like this. And so it's been a complex year for us in the industry, and we're just 6 months in. And so I thought this was a really good episode. We started with episode 1, and coming in here was a lot to take in. And I just have few points, but one of the points that really stood out for me was Peter's point on the fact that aid isn't purely altruistic. And in fact, it is often dictated by foreign policy and geopolitical interest. And the reason why I appreciated this point from Peter was because, especially earlier in the year when the cuts from the US government started rolling in, we had a lot of rhetoric on social media sites like Twitter, that's X, people saying, "Oh yes, please take away their money. International development, they are an evil sector. They are bad people. Why are they giving us money? They have nefarious plans." But I think being open to say that yes, a lot of times aid comes and is not under a disguise. So it's very important for people to understand that international development is not a shady sector. People are not they're not giving you money and then behind your back stealing all your goods. A lot of times it is influenced by foreign policy. It is influenced by geopolitical interest, and as Peter said, that isn't a bad thing. In fact, he mentioned the fact that a lot of times aid that has been done for purely good interest have often been mismanaged and hasn't often been spent well. So I thought it was important for our listeners or people that are fairly new to the sector to understand that it's not something that people are doing with evil intentions, that a lot of times foreign policy does go into it and it's not a bad thing at all. And then he spoke about the fact that sadly during times of aid cuts, programs like political economy, public policy, things that target long-term change are often the ones that experience severe cuts. And I thought that was it's it's just the nature of life, right? People want immediate instant benefit, and when you're telling me that, oh, it's down the line that I'll see the change, it's easier to cut them, and often that is not the right choice to be made. And so those were just some of my major takeaway. But I thought that this was a really good episode, really insightful, and just a lot to take in. I'm still processing. So back to you, Richard.
Yeah, those are really good insights, Favour. I think the first thing for me to say is I'm a little bit conflicted. So as you mentioned at the beginning of the episode, I do have a petition right now on Parliament's website, and I would encourage anyone listening to this episode to check out that petition. It's in favour of international development assistance. And it comes at a time when it genuinely feels like it's under threat. There's an existential threat to it, and there's part of me that would love for what Peter says to be more simplistically in favour of aid. Right? I've got a petition. I'm a supporter. I've seen firsthand the wonderful things that aid have done. I would love for it just to be a very simple, clear narrative, but life isn't like that, right? Life is inevitably messy. It's usually possible for more than one thing to be true at the same time. So it can be true that aid overall is a good thing for the world to have. It's an important thing. It's an obligation and perhaps a duty for country to be able to lend assistance to help other countries to catch up and not have to go at a pace which perhaps would otherwise be the case based on legacy issues. That can be true. And it can also be true that not all aid has been spent particularly well in the past. And that doesn't mean that all aid is spent badly, but it means that there certainly is room for improvement, and these sectors should be trying to make those improvements as well. And I think that's exactly where Peter is coming from on this. He's not trying to say aid is bad in itself, but he's trying to say, okay, how can we make the little aid that we have remaining the most impactful as possible? How can we help with things which are going to make meaningful changes in people's lives? So that's the first point I would make on this favour. Is that I think, unfortunately, as much as I would like there to be a simple, positive narrative around aid, it's a messier thing, and it's something that we need to have room to say it's not just about overall aid, it's also about how aid is spent, and both can be true. The second thing I want to really draw attention to is Peter turning the political economy lens back on ourselves as international donors, whether it's the UK government, the US government, the EU, but turning that lens back and saying, okay, this stuff does not live in a vacuum. The UK government for many years had a separate government department for international development. It had its own Secretary of State, and to a large degree, a lot of us officials within that department saw that we were accountable for delivering against lofty development goals, that we weren't there primarily as an arm of foreign policy. There may have been soft power that was attached as part of it, but we were able largely to live in a world of thinking we were technocrats going about technocratic solutions. And I think over time, maybe that was never the case. Maybe it was always more of an illusion rather than a reality. But I think over time that illusion has slipped quite substantially, and it's become much more explicit about what UK interests are, and being upfront and open about what the UK interests are in all of this. Now, I don't think that there's always been a nefarious hidden agenda about UK, because if there were, we were doing it very badly. Because if you think about how some countries go about advancing business opportunities for their companies in their countries, UK was very bad at that. And it got to a point where I've been in meetings, delegations where you would see maybe a new government would come into a country like Nigeria, and then you'd see all the countries lining up to meet the president or the vice president, and you would see that they would all come with their whole host of foreign policy instruments, right? You'd have their development agencies, you'd have their foreign policy people, you'd have their trade and investment arms, you would have their, the US side, they would have OPIC, that was the equivalent of BII for the UK, sort of the investment bank for going into developing countries. And they would come with a coherent package and say, this is us, this is what we've got to offer your country, this is the whole landscape of it. And I think it was always harder for the UK to have that join up, because we were quite purist, or we tried to be quite purist on the development front. It was difficult to be able to line up and say, oh, and here are the UK businesses that are coming to enter the market. And I think there's been a shift over time, which is perhaps making that more acceptable to say, look, this is the full arsenal of instruments we have, which we're offering your country. Some of them are about international development, some of them are about commercial interests for our country, which could also be mutually beneficial for your country. Some of them are about diplomatic ties and all the rest of it. And so I think in a way, there's a movement towards a more explicit representation of those different aspects of foreign interest and diplomatic ties. So I think it's right that Peter turns the lens to the political economy of countries themselves. And that's not to say, the binary of, is international development all about charity? Is it all about self-interest? What is it about? I think the reality is just saying, look, it's messy. There are different factors that are feeding through. But is it possible to do good through international development assistance? Absolutely. And overwhelmingly in my career, I've seen good that's been done from international development assistance. And if I hadn't, I wouldn't be pushing for it. So it's just that we're living in a very messy situation, and we're trying to make things better. And all credit to Peter for championing the aid effectiveness agenda in a world where aid is becoming much scarcer than it's ever been.
Yes, thank you, Peter. And I think just on your final points there, just two words that Peter had said, talking about the fact that as a sector, we need to be both honest and modest. Honesty, I think of the fact that when you start learning economics, they tell you that we make use of models. And so models aren't exact replicas. So it's just, for instance, when you take a look at a map of a city, it doesn't tell you where each house is, but it's a rough sketch enough to explain to you what you are looking at. And so that's us being honest and saying that, okay, when we bring programs, when we bring initiatives, this is not going to be all encompassing, as much as it's only in an ideal world. And then we need to be modest in, say, understanding the results that we can get at a certain time frame. It's possible that in a couple of years all the plans that we have can come to pass, but it's very, very important, just as Peter said, that we need to be both honest and modest. And so yeah, that is a major takeaway, and really grateful to him and for this episode.
Yeah, I mean, let's bring it back to flywheel economics principles, right? So we like to treat economies as ecosystems, and we like to, see the role of the policymaker as a gardener. And I think here the analogy is, perhaps if we had a vegetable patch in our garden, and perhaps there were some weeds in the vegetable patch, does that mean we get rid of the vegetable patch? No, we try and remove the weeds, right? We try and weed them out, and we try and get support and nourishment to the vegetables that are growing and are being fruitful in their produce. And so I think that's what has to happen with the aid sector, right? So, I mean, it looks like globally the vegetable patch is getting much smaller. And so the opportunity for having fruits is minimizing. And it just means that, I guess, if we are to accept that, which it pains me to have to accept, and I would still advocate for people to go to my petition on Parliament's website and to sign that petition to support aid expenditure. But if that vegetable patch is shrinking, then we've got to get as much productivity in that patch as we possibly can. And that means that we've got to do things very thoughtfully, very mindfully, and we can, because there are many bright people working in the field, and it's not beyond us to be able to work how to get the maximum square inch productivity and produce as we possibly can. There's something called square inch gardening, which I would encourage you to look into at some point. It's all about as much as you can pack in to a small amount of space. And I think that's what we've got to do, sadly. And it's not a bad thing. And I hope that when that space expands, which I think it probably will favor, because I don't see this as the problems that the world faces have not gone away. Climate change is still there. Conflict is still there. The underlying factors of poverty and what the ills that then breeds, the pressures that puts on people's lives, and those things are still there. They haven't changed. The world has not suddenly solved all those problems, and so there needs to be solutions that are set up to try and address those issues. And I don't believe that everyone was daft before with the solutions that came together, as imperfect as they were. They were the best attempt at trying to tackle some of these very deep-rooted problems that exist out there. So I don't think that Elon Musk getting rid of US aid along with Donald Trump, I don't think that means that they come up with a completely radically new solution that suddenly solves all the problems. I think the solutions look very much like a lot of the elements of what was happening before. But it's perhaps having more humility about what those things can achieve and what they can't achieve, and understanding the political economy as well. So bringing it back to the flywheel economics approach, it's something where there's definitely a need to get as much productivity as we can from our little patch of our vegetable patch in our garden. So that's it from me, Faber. I think this is a fascinating and timely mini series for what the industry is going through. Any concluding thoughts from you before I ask you to sort of wrap up?
Thanks, Richard. No, I think I totally agree with all that you have said. You have put my thoughts into words. And so we'll continue to fight in this sector because we know that we are doing good. But just as Peter said, it is messy. Not unfortunately, just realistically, it is messy. We would want it to be simple. But if we really think about it, what aspect of life is simple? None, right? And so understanding, and I feel like I have so much optimism from this episode, which is crazy because you're saying, oh, this is one of the turbulent times in the development sector, but there's a lot of optimism because if we can be honest with ourselves, it means that we can really dig deep and adapt and now become better. And I know that, just as you said, you have not seen the last of us. And so for people that are interested, and we invite everyone, actually, if you are eligible, to go to the Parliament website and sign Richard's petition. And we have the link to the petition in this podcast episode. So just take a look at the show notes and then you find a link and then you can sign the podcast. But for this episode, that's all from us for today. Thank you to Peter for coming here and shining a light on this really important issue. It's really eye opening, and I know for me personally, it has been thought provoking. To our listeners, we are always grateful that you listen, and we invite you to continue to engage with us across Instagram, X, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Our handle is Flywheel Economics. Now, if you are want to continue to engage with our other resources, you can find us at flywheeleconomics.com. That's our website. There you find other podcast episodes and also related articles. But for today, this is all. Until next time, this has been the Flywheel Economics podcast.